Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, from the classroom to the courtroom, an exclusive interview with State Attorney General Raul Torres on public education reform and his investigation into harsh discipline at the school district with the most Indigenous students in the country.
I'm not going to stand aside while children are not getting the education that they're constitutionally entitled to.
And a special roundtable discussion on what the AG calls stalled progress since the 2018 Yazzie Martinez ruling. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm senior producer Lou DeVizio. It's been 5 years since a judge mandated greater educational equity in the landmark Yazzie Martinez ruling. But State Attorney General Raul Torres tells New Mexico In-Depth's Bryant Furlow that there's, quote, frustration with the lack of progress, unquote, and that he intends to take over the case. In less than 15 minutes, executive producer Jeff Proctor asks a special roundtable if the impacted Indigenous and disadvantaged communities are hopeful that Torres will get things done. Then we shift our attention to another splash Torres made in the headlines last month. The first-term Democratic AG announced plans to investigate Gallup-McKinley County schools following an investigation from New Mexico In-Depth and ProPublica that spotlighted the district's disproportionately harsh discipline of Native American students. In the second half of today's show, Jeff asks our roundtable about the limits of the Attorney General's power to force change. But first, in partnership with New Mexico In-Depth, Executive Director Trip Jennings' exclusive interview with Attorney General Torres. In part one of their conversation, Trip asks Torres why he decided to step in on the Yazzie Martinez case.
Raul Torres, thank you so much for joining me on New Mexico in Focus this week.
Thanks for having me.
As we just heard, you want to take over the litigation of the landmark Yazzie Martinez case. Mm-hmm. You told my reporter Bryant Furlow last month that you have broad authority to do this. Can you explain to our audience what that authority is and how it works?
Well, actually, before I get into the authority that the Attorney General's office has, I think one of the things that's really important for people to understand is the role that I think the Attorney General's office needs to play in being an advocate for people that frankly don't have the resources or the opportunity to advocate for themselves. And it's really that recognition of that fundamental duty that has drawn me to try and be more of an advocate for the least advantaged, and that starts, in my judgment, with children. As you mentioned, the Attorney General's office is responsible for representing the state, public officers, individuals, agencies, whenever they are a party to litigation. But in other parts of the country, there is a broader understanding of the role of the Attorney General's office that doesn't just place it as a de facto defense attorney for state agencies. It actually plays and needs to play a much broader role in protecting the public interest. And so when we took the action that we did with respect to reasserting ourselves and our control over the Yazzie Martinez litigation, it was in recognition of the fact that we have both an obligation to represent the Public Education Department, the state of New Mexico, but also an obligation and a constitutional and I believe a moral obligation to try and stand up and make sure that we are abiding by court orders and that we are ensuring that everyone, including New Mexico's children, have access to the resources that they need.
Okay. So you told Bryant that you were frustrated by the lack of progress in the Yazzie Martinez case. Yeah. Can you say a little more about, were you personally frustrated? You mentioned moral obligation. Can you maybe, go into that a little more, why you felt it was necessary to do this?
Well, I come from a family on my father's side in particular where, there really wasn't English spoken in the home until they went to school, and it was education, it was public education that allowed my family, my father's family, to be lifted out of rural poverty in New Mexico. And so I don't just look at the Yazzie litigation, the Martinez litigation, as something that needs to be examined from the lens of an attorney, but I think about it in terms of what it means for so many other families in our state, both in urban settings and also in rural communities, where they need access to high quality education as a ladder of opportunity to lift their families up. And the Yazzie Martinez litigation is really groundbreaking. It is a really consequential action, and quite frankly, had I been in this role earlier, I probably would have assumed the role of the plaintiff. This action was brought by the Center on Law and Poverty. It's something that frankly, the Attorney General's office, advocating on behalf of the rights of children, should seriously consider its role and its obligation to vindicate those rights. And so, as you know, Judge Singleton issued an order over 5 years ago, which clearly identified constitutional violations, inadequate resources, and a fundamental failure on the part of the state to give equal access primarily to indigenous students, Native American and English language learners. And in that order set out some broad mandates that the state was required to fulfill. And look, there has been progress, there's been increased funding, and I think the legislature and the governor deserve credit for putting more money into public education. That said, 5 years on, we are still very far from satisfying our constitutional obligation to make sure that every kid in this state has the opportunity that my family got so many generations ago, because we no longer have the excuse anymore of not having enough money. We've certainly been blessed with lots of oil and gas revenue and budget surpluses in the last few years. The question now is what kind of deeper commitments we're going to be able to make on the part of the state to make sure that everyone has a fair and equal shot at rising in our society. And so that's what brought me to the litigation.
Okay, so assuming that you do take over the litigation, what can the public expect to see as far as the speed, the philosophy, personnel? And please be specific so we kind of can understand what you mean.
Well, so the first step in this process was to sit down with the plaintiffs and try to understand their perspective. We met with the Yazzie legal team, and they indicated to us, they're now in post-judgment discovery. They're gathering new information, and they have expressed frustration about the lack of a specific plan. I mean, that's fundamentally what is missing in this. There have been some aspirational sort of reports that have been put out by the state, but there is not a clear roadmap for progress, hitting certain milestones by certain dates. Now, I come to this as the son of not only a career prosecutor, but a career public school teacher. And I know enough to know that I am not an education expert, but I also understand that we have expertise in this state about how to develop measurable metrics, whether it means new resources for the amount of funding that goes into classrooms, the kind of transportation needs that rural communities are often hit with, the kind of supports, technology that needs to be deployed to these districts. And my role in this is to try to create a framework to get the parties talking again. One of the saddest things that I learned from the Yazzie team is there's been no effective communication between the plaintiffs and the state. What the state has been engaged in for the last several years is trying to do everything that it can to go to court, dismiss the case, and get itself out. And what it needs to be doing is figuring out concrete ways to meet its obligations.
Speaking of the state's, kind of orientation to this, I mean, the governor has said that, you should just focus on accountability of school districts. You shouldn't have any part of this kind of litigation. Sure. What happens if you guys don't agree over you're taking over the litigation? Who gets to be the decider on what happens?
I'm still hopeful that we can have productive conversations with the governor's office and the administration, and that we can help them understand what our constitutional authority actually is. It's pretty clearly laid out in statute. I would hope that we wouldn't spend unnecessary time and energy on the front end battling over whether or not I have this authority. It's pretty clear that we do. And it's also pretty clear that not enough progress has been made. And so my rationale for getting involved in this is that the legal strategy that the state has adopted up to this point, as I said, has been focused on getting out from under court supervision, and what it needs to be focused on is compliance, constitutional
Is it
compliance.
going to be a case of like your attorneys are going to talk to my attorneys and work this out? Is that how that works?
Well, the first thing is that the Attorney General's office has the exclusive authority to represent the state. I mean, that's the job at its most basic level. It has that opportunity and that authority. If it becomes necessary to test the limits of that authority, I mean, that is something we will certainly do if we have to. But again, my hope is that we start having conversations. What's been going on is the Yazzie plaintiffs have been taking depositions of people in the public education department, and as I understand it, most of the depositions of the people that they identified as being responsible for implementing Yazzie Martinez are no longer even with the department. And so we got to get out of the lawyering business and move this back to a place where we're actually in the problem-solving business.
So speaking of not agreeing, I mean, you've came out publicly when to say that you would not defend the governor's gun ban in court. I mean, is this just a case of you two playing politics? Is this what this is?
Look, we have an obligation. I have an obligation to make sure that the state lives up to judicial orders, right? Judge Singleton made it very clear in that order that the state had failed to meet its constitutional obligations. And what is clear is that, someone needs to step up on behalf of the state of New Mexico and start advocating for these children and not advocating for agency heads and people who are not making progress. I would be more than happy if I saw sufficient progress in this case and the plaintiffs could come before the court and say, yes, the state is acting in good faith and we're delivering on these things, to leave that aside. But I'm not going to stand aside while children are not getting the education that they're constitutionally entitled to.
Thanks to Tripp Jennings and Attorney General Torres. The second part of their conversation is coming up in a little over 15 minutes. Right now, we want to put the Yazzie Martinez case in context. What prompted it, the state's struggle to comply with a court order, and the implications of the Attorney General stepping in. To tackle all of that, executive producer Jeff Proctor leads a special panel with 3 different perspectives on the case.
Thanks, Lou. Joining me around the table are Regis Pecos, the former Cochiti Pueblo governor and co-founder of the Santa Fe Indian School Leadership Institute. Across the table, you've already heard from Tripp Jennings, executive director at New Mexico In Depth and my former editor, and current APS board member and senior fellow at the One Generation Fund, Danielle Gonzalez. Thank you all for being here. I would like to begin by kind of taking a step back to July 2018 when Judge Sarah Singleton made her ruling in the Yazzie Martinez case. Regis, what conditions existed in New Mexico public schools at that time, and why was this case necessary?
It really was, first of all, an affirmation of what has been documented over the course of the last 150 years with regard to what devastating results become reality from weaponizing education as a form of assimilation, in this case for indigenous children. The culminating affirmation is what the first indigenous-led study had affirmed was necessary to create new systems and institutions to redefine education so that education is balanced with all of the core values necessary for the maintenance of the ways of life for indigenous people. The low education attainment manifesting in poverty, manifesting in hunger, in health disparities, cycles of violence, and ultimately the highest rates of suicide in the nation here in New Mexico, and among those taking their lives are Native children.
That is some deep and historical context. Danielle, there's no chance to get to everything that was in the judge's order, but if we could maybe summarize a little bit, what did Judge Singleton order the state to do to begin to start to heal and rectify what Regis just described?
What's interesting about Judge Singleton's order is she looked at a variety of different factors. One was looking at what she calls inputs and outputs to make her decision. So in terms of inputs into the system, what are the things that adults who are responsible for the educational system have control over, and are those adequate and sufficient? So she looked at everything from buildings, facilities, desks, pencils, to some of the less tangible things like teachers and their professional development, teachers and their training, instructional materials, and curriculum. So are those inputs sufficient and adequate enough to meet the needs of the 4 groups that she mentioned as at risk, and that which are, as Regis mentioned, Native American students, students with disabilities, English learners, and low-income kids. So she found those inputs are inadequate, and then she looked at the outputs and she characterized those in 3 ways. One is test scores, one was graduation rates, and the other is college remediation rates. So when our kids are leaving our K-12 system, are they having to do remedial courses in higher ed? The answer was yes, and she cited a whole litany of data on that. So that was the kind of the main thing, is the inputs and outputs. There were 2 other things that I think are really important, though. One is New Mexico actually already had in place and has in place a lot of the right policies, the laws in our Indian Education Act, in our Hispanic Education Act, in our Bilingual and Multicultural Education Act, and in our state constitution. So on paper, our state has committed to this culturally responsive, relevant, and adequate education already. So she found that that's there, but we're just not doing what we need to be doing to meet those laws. The other thing is she looked at funding, and funding in a couple of ways, which is I think a little bit unique to other education lawsuits. She looked at, is there adequate funding and how is it being spent? And again, found on both fronts, we're not meeting the charge. So we're not putting enough money into the system, and we don't have enough accountability over how it's being spent, again, on those inputs and outputs. So it was a pretty rich decision, and like you said, we don't have time to go into all the details, but there's a whole lot to dig into there, which really is a call to action for all of us in education.
Stemming from, at the end of the day, a rolling constitutional violation. At the end of the day, what she determined was that our education system, our public education system here, was a rolling violation of the state constitution, right?
Absolutely.
5 years have now passed since Judge Singleton issued her ruling. Tripp, I know New Mexico in Depth has covered Yazzie Martinez pretty extensively. I'm curious, in the course of the stories that you've published, people you've interviewed, people your reporters have interviewed, what has the sense from them been in terms of progress in complying what we just laid out?
You know, there's a conversation about money that's being spent, or maybe new allocations. You know, that conversation is one conversation. Then there's a separate conversation about curriculum change, about getting teachers who maybe look like the students in their classrooms. And I think on the monetary conversation, the state has made some progress in talking with some of the folks that we've interviewed, but I think there are those who say it's not as much progress as they should have made, especially in a time period where you have historic surpluses. The other thing is, as far as curriculum change, getting more the pipeline of teachers, I think there needs to be a lot of work. That's what we're hearing from people. I think that there's a lot of frustration with not as much progress as was hoped for. I mean, that ruling was 70 pages, but I think the findings of fact were like 600 pages. And if you read through that, it is extraordinary what Judge Singleton, found and then put out there publicly. And I will tell you that I've covered education in, here and there in many states, not just New Mexico. That was a wealth that opened my mind to some of the things that were happening around districts, rural and urban. And I think that there's not been as much progress as a lot of people hope for. Something that Regis and I have talked about is that, frankly, we've had federal reports dating back to 1928 about education in states, the Merriam Report and then the Kennedy Report in the 60s. Thank you, Regis, for pointing those out to me. I think it's just not a lot of as much progress as they thought there should be.
You mentioned the word frustration, and I'm going to ask you a question in just a moment. Frustration, I think, is a theme that we'll get to a little bit, but let's catch viewers up to where we are now. Obviously, the Attorney General has said that he would like to take over the state's role in litigation on Yazzie Martinez. So I have to ask the 2 big questions. He says he has the authority to do this, Regis. So my questions are, does he? And if in fact he does, should the public expect a change in terms of the progress that we've been talking about?
I'm not an attorney, one to conclusively respond to that question. But if he does, then I think it is a welcome opportunity, as many have expressed as a result of the frustration of what reflects very little movement in the last 5 years. And so Chairman Lente, as one example, publicly stated just a few days ago in a convening here with tribal representatives from Navajo Nation, Mescalero, Jicarilla, and the Pueblos, that if that is what one helps to change by bringing people to the table, then it's a welcome opportunity. Not so much one targeting the governor or PED in that lack of movement, but the crisis that we're in compels us to look at how collaboratively we are moving through these discussions. And so if his entrance helps to move us by bringing plaintiffs, as he's articulated, to the table, then I think it's a positive entrance into the dynamics of the stakeholders moving forward.
Even philosophically, right? Even if it's just a philosophical shift to get more people to the table. So people tend to think of the Attorney General as a prosecutor. We use that phrase top cop, the state's top cop, all the time. So even from a public perception perspective, Danielle, is the Attorney General's office the right place for this to live, leadership in the state's role in this case?
Yeah, so I'm of two minds. I do agree with Regis on the perspective that maybe this is the kick in the pants that is needed to bring some accountability, to bring some action, to bring some needed conversations with the right people. On the other hand, keeping this in the court system and our criminal justice system and the legal system is probably not what's best ultimately for our students. I think legal fees are going to continue to mount up. How else might we better spend those funds? I think, it's kind of likening it to a custody battle. You can continue to have mom and dad fight over the kids, but does that ultimately benefit the kids? And I think the other thing is that this is just another technical fix. I started with mentioning that we had all of the right laws on paper. We have the right paper there, we have the right laws, we have enough money, to your point. But I think what's really needed is the deep cultural shifts, the mindset shifts, the healing that you've talked about, which is not going to happen through our court system. It's not going to happen through subpoenas. It's not going to happen through plans and legal documents. It's going to happen through deep work, deep relational work at the level closest to kids and families. And I think that's what's still really missing from this whole conversation around progress or lack of progress with this.
To politicize this will only result in losing the merits of what collectively we have to contribute in addressing the crisis in education. And to your very point and analogy, none of us want to see children be the pawns in a whole nother level of who's right, who has the legal right. That is what we don't need at the moment. So embracing the challenges on all parts, the executive, the legislative, the Attorney General in his discussions about entering this, really should be one that we collectively embrace to all come to the table and begin to roll up our sleeves and respond in a collaborative way if we're going to shift the paradigm.
You just answered one of my questions, and I appreciate you getting there. And I want to stick a pin in the politics for just a moment. Tripp, you just finished interviewing the Attorney General right over on the other part of our set. I'm curious what your takeaways were in terms of his interest in this case. What stuck out to you in the course of your conversation?
I mean, I think that, what he expressed it seemed to be a real passion for this. he mentioned that his own father's story was kind of really moved him. His father grew up in a mostly Spanish-speaking home, so he really identified with maybe the educational programs that his father went through, and some of the deficiencies, as well as his mom being a public school teacher. I think that he's prepared to, I know we talked about, maybe not getting lost in the possible turf battle, institutions. Political, but institutional battle. I think he's prepared to probably push that if there's some challenge to him taking this over. He has spoken that in other states, attorneys general have this kind of power to protect children and whatnot. I got the sense that he seems like he's going to move forward on this if he's challenged. Those were my takeaways on the conversation with him.
So I want to spend just a moment on the politics of this. It would be very difficult to not see this as a piece of a whole. Obviously, the Attorney General very publicly just refused to defend the governor's public health order and a firearm carrying ban in public. It's tough not to put that together with this. But Regis, to your point of not placing children and their education and their well-being in the middle of something like this, how does that get accomplished in the kind of hyper-partisan, even though these are two members of the same party, fight that we tend to see on the political landscape now?
I think you have to unpack all of those elements legally, politically, to really get back at the heart of what we have to do. Because this issue, this crisis, really has been generationally. We've not had the opportunity of why there was such great optimism with this landmark decision. For Indigenous peoples, this is really the first opportunity to redefine education, where language and culture is at the heart, and education is not weaponized to be a process of assimilating us. We are at the point in this journey where language is the most fragile as a result of generational attacks on something that is central to who we are, central with the maintenance of a way of life. So if we fail, our elders teach us that when language is lost, culture will be as well. And when you lose those two, the elders say that there is no more us in the way that the Creator gifted us language and culture and a way of life, that every generation before us have sacrificed, have pushed back. And if we fail in this time, the question we always ask is, how will future generations speak of us? Or to ask the question, what do we want most that future generations inherit from us? And at the very center of that answer is language and culture for the maintenance of a way of life.
I knew this was going to feel way too fast, but that's unfortunately all the time that we have for the first segment. But we're not done yet. We'll meet right back here in less than 15 minutes to talk about the Attorney General's involvement in a different education issue New Mexico in Depth brought to light as well: harsh disciplinary tactics at the largely indigenous Gallup-McKinley schools.
Thanks to Jeff and our panelists. The governor's spokesperson sent a statement in response to our questions about the Attorney General's decision to take over litigation in the Yazzie Martinez case, saying in part, quote, "We have made clear since the Attorney General made this announcement that there need to be more eyes on school districts and how they are using or not using the resources made available by the state. The Attorney General should assist the state in that work to hold schools accountable. Over $4 billion, a 56% increase by this administration, flows through the PED to districts every year, and we know that districts continue to underutilize those resources." Now, to another situation the Attorney General is getting involved in: the disproportionate expulsions at Gallup-McKinley schools. Bryant Furlow's reporting for New Mexico In Depth and ProPublica last December found that Native students are expelled from New Mexico public schools at a much higher rate than other children, and the numbers at the Gallup-McKinley district are driving that disparity. In an analysis of state data, Bryant and ProPublica found Native students' expulsions nearly doubled those of white students at Gallup-McKinley, and the rate is even higher across the state. The district has 1/4 of the state's Native students, but accounts for 3/4 of Native student expulsions statewide over 4 years ending in 2020. At the time of Bryant's reporting, the Attorney General said he found the data concerning, but just last month, Torres announced his intention to open an investigation into the disproportionately harsh punishment at Gallup-McKinley. Now, for the first time since that announcement, Attorney General Torres explains how he came to that decision and what an investigation might look like.
Okay, I want to move now to your decision to investigate the expulsion and long-term suspension rates at Gallup-McKinley School District. Why is school discipline so important to this larger conversation of public education in New Mexico?
Well, we have known for quite some time that there is disproportionate punishment, not just in New Mexico, but across the country for children of color, Native American, African American, Hispanic children, that when it comes to the rate at which they are disciplined, placed in detention, suspension, and expulsion. So, and we also know that the disruption of their ability to attain an education actually increases all sorts of really sort of difficult and oftentimes dangerous likely outcomes as adults. It's one of the root causes of the pipeline that we have from under-resourced communities to the criminal justice system and to jail. And look, as a district attorney and as the Attorney General, I'm trying to do everything that I can to limit the times that law enforcement is called upon to intervene in a situation with an adult who is either violent or dangerous or impacting public safety. And I will use every available tool to do that. And if that means going upstream and talking to school districts about their disciplinary policies and trying to figure out whether or not there's disproportionate impacts for communities of color, that's what we're going to do. And I have an obligation to try and do both of those things at the same time. We have opened an investigation with the McKinley
Can I ask you
County.
about that?
Yes, absolutely.
Gallup-McKinley Superintendent Mike Hyatt has said that he's not been notified of the investigation. Is that accurate?
He's actually been to my office, and probably since you've talked to him last, they reached out, and we had an initial conversation, and we told them our plans. To their credit, they said they were willing to provide any information that they have and give broader context to the situation.
When was that? When did you guys meet, and when did you?
The meeting was within the last couple of weeks.
Okay, the last couple of weeks
that we've had this meeting, and
okay.
so and we will be following up with him to try and get access to the underlying data. Their contention is that there is some misunderstanding about the data. We haven't drawn any conclusions yet, but I was very clear that we intend to dig into this and try to understand what's going on.
Okay.
And
can I follow up with
sure.
The Public Education Department has said it would share updated information with you as well.
Yes.
The investigation that we did, the story that we did, was only through 2020. Right. Have they shared that information with you? And if they have, what does the data show? So
we haven't gotten to the point where we've gotten updated data. And so the first step is to go out and sit down and look at the data that they have and bring it to, if necessary, an independent auditor to come in and look at this and see what is actually going on, and then compare that to the data that is being held by the state, because I know that there is probably some reconciliation that needs to be done there. But the point is that this is something that the Attorney General's office, frankly, should be actively engaged in. And I don't know yet, and I won't judge whether or not it constitutes a civil rights violation, because I don't have enough independent information to know about the quality of the information. But it's the fact that we're in this business that should send a powerful signal to school districts across the state. Well, as you know, the governor pocket vetoed Senate Bill 426. That would have given you subpoena power. In this case, what can you do if the school district decides, I know they said they were willing to work with you, but if they decide not to turn over records, what can you do? What kind of tool do you use? Well, so and I'm glad you raised that. One of the more disappointing aspects of the pocket veto is that it provided for what was called civil investigative demands. It's a discrete discovery tool that allows us to gather information before filing a lawsuit. We don't, unfortunately, now have that authority, and so we are left with the regular tools of litigation, which fundamentally means engagement through correspondence, communication that is informal, and that's what we're doing now with the school district. If it became necessary, we could certainly file a lawsuit and then gain access to that
So
information
and go to force them.
And we would have to go and file a complaint and issue subpoenas and engage in the discovery process.
So it sounds like this, the pocket veto probably will slow down and hamper this investigative process if they don't comply.
Yeah, I think what was really not well understood is that, number one, we're going to engage in these investigations regardless. But what the legislation would have permitted us to do is to open discrete investigations without an unnecessary litigation on the front end, and without getting into this protracted fight over what kind of access we had to different kinds of information. It's a very short and discrete but powerful tool that we would be able to use. We use it in the consumer protection space all the time. And that's probably the biggest hindrance that we have by not having that legislation passed.
Okay. Have you or your staff begun to talk with Navajo Nation officials? Because Gallup-McKinley, basically these are primarily Navajo students that are, the expulsion and long-term suspension rates. Have you begun to talk with Navajo Nation officials? And if so, what's their reaction been to this situation?
So we're organizing a trip to Winslow, Arizona, for me to sit down and have an extended conversation with the president of the Navajo Nation. This is going to be in the next several weeks, but it's not just about the disciplinary issues in that school district, but about issues related to criminal jurisdiction. There's been some real upheaval created by recent Supreme Court decisions, and also a number of issues pertaining to everything from cannabis to lots of other issues. But this will certainly be part of the conversation, and I know that the president and the leadership of the Navajo Nation is eager to have that conversation about the work that we're doing.
Eagerness to talk about this?
They have expressed a willingness to talk about all of the issues, and that's one of the other changes that's actually in progress right now in the Attorney General's office, is the establishment of the first ever dedicated Indian Affairs unit. We've never had that before. What we used to do is we used to send issue area attorneys to go and have consultation.
So in your office, you're going to establish this division?
That's right.
Okay.
And it focuses exclusively on the intersection of all of the issues in our office, from law enforcement to regulation to school funding, all of those issues that will be all centralized in one unit that is dedicated to establishing concrete government-to-government consultations in a way that is more structured and more nuanced, and really starts to develop this relationship over time, rather than sending different attorneys from the office to talk about different issues, is try to understand the intersection between all of those issues in the state.
So beyond the expulsion and long-term suspension rates at Gallup-McKinley, are there other practices that you and your agency will look at Gallup-McKinley? Are there other issues or practices?
Right now, we are focused on the disciplinary issues, but as you can imagine, we talked earlier about Yazzie Martinez. They obviously have a keen interest in that, and they obviously have an interest in having a deeper appreciation and understanding of the role we're going to play now, assuming defense for the state of New Mexico. And so my hope is that we're able to resolve lots of issues, all for the betterment and to the benefit of the students in that community.
Once again, thank you to Tripp Jennings and to Attorney General Torres for making time to come in and clarify his position on both of these cases. Earlier this week, Gallup-McKinley Superintendent Mike Hyatt attacked New Mexico in-depth reporting in an email to us, but he did not offer any facts of his own. Hyatt says he has not been formally notified of Torres' investigation. In an emailed response for comment, Hyatt told us, quote, "While we know an investigation will be a waste of tax dollars, we do welcome any investigation because Gallup-McKinley County Schools, our staff, and community knows the accusations are false. Discrimination is not what we are about, and we have worked hard to continually build more equity in all aspects of our educational system." Now, back to Executive Producer Jeff Proctor and our panel for reaction to the Attorney General's decision to investigate.
Thanks again to New Mexico Attorney General Raul Torres for answering questions. And welcome back to Regis Pecos, Danielle Gonzalez, and Tripp Jennings. We'll start this segment with you again, Tripp. How did Bryant Furlow, the reporter for New Mexico In Depth, find his way to Gallup-McKinley schools, and how did New Mexico In Depth and ProPublica quantify the findings once Bryant was finished with his reporting?
So this was a situation where we asked a question about disciplining of students statewide. There was not, we kind of said, what do the numbers look like? So we began to try to assemble data from the state. We went to the public education department. They gave us the data of discipline records across the state. Bryant and some of the data scientists, data journalists at ProPublica began analyzing that. And after weeks of analyzing it, they found that there were expulsion rates and long-term suspension rates were much higher among one group, and it was indigenous students. So that was the second round. And then the third round was, why is that? Why is that happening at the state level? And so they asked that question, and they refined some of their analysis looking at the data. And what they found was that one school district was mainly fueling that expulsion and long-term suspension, the high rates, and that was Gallup-McKinley School District. And so
And these were their numbers, just to clarify.
let me say this. They didn't respond to our request for their data, so we went to the public education department, and Gallup-McKinley had given the public education department the data that we were looking at, along with all the other districts, right? Public education department is this gathering place for all this data. So it is, yes, their own data that we looked at, yes.
So what was the reaction when the story published, the first story back in December? Number one, from the community, the folks who live in that area, and number two, from the district. You mentioned they didn't respond to your request for comment.
So yes, this was a months-long investigation, probably most of 2022, and they did not respond to many requests for comment. Over time, that includes all officials at various levels of the district. And it is a practice of ProPublica, and we like this practice, that New Mexico In Depth and ProPublica sent a no surprises letter, which is, these are our conclusions, this is how we arrived at these conclusions, the methodology. Please respond if you see anything that is problematic, that doesn't look like it's correct. We sent that nearly 6 weeks before publication. Didn't hear anything. We published in December, and in January, the superintendent, Mike Hyatt, at a school board meeting, basically just lambasted the story that we did, the analysis, called it ridiculous and fake news, and basically said that really we don't expel that many people. What came out later is that I think because of our story, they went and changed, as I recall, expulsion data to long-term suspension data. Basically, it was like, well, these weren't expulsions, these were actually long-term suspensions. And then we did some data analysis around long-term suspensions, and Gallup-McKinley still, led the state in long-term suspensions.
Yeah,
same thing. So, they didn't like the story. Yeah.
Fair enough. Let's pull back just a little bit and try to place McKinley County and Gallup in particular in New Mexico. Danielle, who lives in that part of the state, who goes to school there, and how has that district tended to fare over time?
Yeah, well, predominantly Native kids. It's a huge part of the population of that school district, and has not performed well over time. Now, there were increases in the early mid 2000s, particularly in some math and reading assessments, but it hasn't been a high performing district, and there are a whole host of reasons. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about some of the intergenerational issues, the trauma, the history of our boarding schools, the poverty, the alcoholism. There's a lot going on out there, and so certainly these are huge issues, but we also need to remember that there's external factors too, but lots of stuff at play.
Regis, what are the downstream effects of the kinds of harsh discipline tactics that Bryant uncovered? How does a school environment like that impact children, families, and community?
There's a high correlation between system failure of our children, that when there is non-relevance in their lives, in their curriculum, compounded by, there's only 3% of Native teachers across all of New Mexico in public schools, so that the reality is, like in Gallup-McKinley, that the majority of children will never see one of their own in the classroom. So the lack of relevance results in young people getting pushed out of schools, and then discipline is really the means by which young people use to force them out, with all of the factors that are articulated, delineated in the findings in this case. But the greater context to appreciate is that that particular region, from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights to the Regional Commission on Civil Rights, from the Navajo Nation's Commission on Civil Rights, all document the kind of long history of racism and discrimination that comes from their own words of the colonial settler framework that continues the underpinnings of racism and discrimination. And it culminates in education to push out young people. The way they find ways is to become problematic. But if every one of you have ever seen some of the first photographs in boarding schools where harsh discipline and enforcement was utilized, Danielle, I don't know if you've ever seen, but there is a photo of handcuffs that are this small, made for children, handcuffed who were 6, 7-year-olds. So this history of harsh treatment, of discipline and enforcement goes all the way back over the course of 150 years. And this larger kind of historical context, unfortunately, plagues that region, and it is the culture that continues to perpetuate this kind of attitudes and behaviors. In all fairness to the folks in Gallup-McKinley, they have been strong advocates, one, to petition the underfunding of dilapidated school facilities. That was another case against the state that the courts, one, concluded was underfunding. They've been strong advocates and proponents in resolving the long-standing impact aid issues. But every time, whether it's 20 incidents or 1 or 2, in that kind of a context, these cases are reminders, and it only peels the scab for that pain and hurt of this history to bleed all over again.
Can I say that we had you mentioned the reaction of the community. We had a public event after this happened in April in Gallup. And 70 people showed up, and people who were, talking to us said that was a pretty large gathering of folks about, this story that we found these rates. What was so moving, and I wanted to say this because Regis mentioned this, what was moving, a lot of it was moving, but what was moving was these grandparents who began to say, I didn't think much of it, but after I read the story, I started talking to my friends, were you treated this way back in school? And they became emotional talking about it. This is something that is generation after generation after generation. And there's one thing to read it in a story, but it's another one to listen to a grandmother or a grandfather talk to you as a human being to human being. And I left that place profoundly kind of changed, I think, understanding that this is a deeply rooted situation.
And it speaks to what Regis just said, which is
Yes.
that school discipline is just a new name
Yes.
for an old system of oppression. I like when I have the chance to try to contextualize New Mexico when I can. Here in our state, attorneys general have typically played the role of defending public entities when they're accused of wrongdoing in court. Here we have an attorney general who would like to play the other side. I wonder, Danielle, if there are examples from around the country we might look to with a slightly different role for an attorney general in a case in the education context like this.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying cases related to student discipline, the school to prison pipeline, are not unique by any means and have been happening forever since we've been collecting data. I also want to acknowledge that there are significant data quality issues. So I understand that you explore the data even more and the disparities still exist, but there are huge problems with our data collection all the way up to the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. So we definitely need to explore data quality issues, period. And we need to look at what's going on at a much deeper level. So yes, there's definitely a role for the Attorney General here. There have been roles that other Attorneys Generals have played in other states as well. But also groups like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, there's other projects out there who have consistently advocated in the courts on behalf of students of color. Because here in New Mexico, certainly the issue is Native American. There's other cases. There was one in Texas where the issue was brown children, black children, Denver, Hispanic children. So this is not unusual. But I think to your point, you have to get into what's happening. There's the data quality issue, there's the reporting, there's the discipline system, there's what's in policy. There's the question of how our educators are trained on how, or not trained rather, on how to handle discipline and behavior issues. And then to your whole point, there's this question around belonging and safety in our schools. And I think we really need to explore what happens to young people when they have this toxic stress level where their cortisol is constantly pumping because they're constantly under threat everywhere they go, and how that leads to behavior issues as well. So lots of work to do on trauma-informed approaches. It's a really complex issue, and so I do think there's certainly a role for the AG in this, but roles across the system as well that we need to explore.
I appreciate that you keep orienting us back toward the below the surface pieces of this. I want to ask one more question of Tripp about the sort of higher level stuff, the surface level stuff. In your conversation with the Attorney General, did he talk some about what the limitations of this investigation might be, in particular in light of the governor vetoing a bill that would have essentially given him subpoena power in this case?
That's right. The governor pocket vetoed. She didn't sign the bill, for those of you who don't know what pocket veto means, by the deadline. So the bill was killed. It would have given created this division and given the Attorney General the subpoena power to demand records of any public entity that he deemed that he needed to investigate. Now that he doesn't have subpoena records, he is hoping to work with Gallup McKinley. They have met, the Attorney General's office and Gallup McKinley officials, and he hopes they comply with his request. If they don't, then he would have to probably, one tool is go to the court and sue them for the records, which, I think my interpretation would be that this slows down the process of the investigation. And I think he said that's one possible interpretation, but I think it's a legitimate interpretation of what would happen without the subpoena records.
Let's end on maybe a little bit of a hopeful note. There are alternatives to expulsion and harsh disciplinary tactics that we have seen in schools. Tripp and I just had a conversation at this table a few weeks ago with somebody from PED who is working on restorative justice practices. So my question is this: Gallup McKinley's not using those, at least not as of now. But what would change in that district look like, regardless of the outcome of the Attorney General's investigation?
The process and the principles that are traditional in that kind of restorative justice framework really brings all of the parties together: children, family, relatives, schools. And it is a process that addresses the truth of the issues, but there is a process that is a natural outcome, and that is owning responsibility, where you own that responsibility, but it is bringing people back into good standing as the ultimate outcome. And in bringing people back into good standing, it kind of restores people's starting all over again. But the most important part of the process is really underscoring that there is a collective and shared responsibility to really think about community being a significant part of schools, schools being a very significant part of the community. And right now, schools historically have not been safe places. And so restorative justice can really respond to address multiple elements to redefine schools as a places that are shared in the ownership, with shared responsibilities, with shared accountabilities. But the history of schools has resulted in the conditioning that someone else knows best, and there is not a relationship between parents, community, and schools that can result through this process, a restoration of this relationship that is so fundamental to everyone's well-being.
Another conversation that went by way too fast. Thanks again to all of you for coming in and talking through both of these stories. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks to our panelists and Attorney General Raul Torres for making time to come in and speak with us. Now to a story we'll have our eye on during the week ahead. State District Judge Fred Van Solen has 1 week to issue a ruling in a lawsuit challenging the congressional districts drawn and approved by the legislature in 2021. The case began in early 2022 after the Republican Party of New Mexico and 7 individuals filed a lawsuit accusing the Democratic-controlled legislature of attempting to dilute the power of Republican voters. At particular issue is Congressional District 2, where Democrat Gabe Vasquez narrowly edged out Republican incumbent Yvette Herrell in 2022. Van Solen's ruling, which the Supreme Court will review, is due October 6th. Meanwhile, we're also digesting some last-minute developments. Wednesday, the Supreme Court granted an emergency petition dismissing Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and Lieutenant Governor Howie Morales as defendants in the case. Testimony and arguments wrapped up earlier today, Friday, in Judge Van Solen's courtroom. We'll let you know what happens when that ruling comes down next week. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the viewers like you.